My grandmother was a strange woman. She lived by herself and rarely went outside her 2-story house in a reclusive, forested area. She was a sculptor, an artist. She had this obsession with making china dolls. As a child, I would visit her frequently. Each time I visited, she would have 5 or 6 new additions to her family. The dolls were shockingly lifelike, as if there was actually human emotion trapped behind those glass eyes. But the thing that really creeped me out as a kid was the fact that they all portrayed the same emotions: sadness, horror, and agony. Although the dolls were otherwise beautiful with perfect, delicate facial features, painted faces, and splendid clothes, none of the dolls were ever smiling or laughing. I quickly learned to steer clear of the doll room, where grandmother kept all the dolls. My grandmother made a living making and selling fine bone chin, but she never ever sold any of her dolls. Despite the unease I felt with the dolls, I managed to enjoy the time I spent at my grandmother's house. She would usually allow me precious free time to play while she spent her time in her workshop. She had modified what had been an old garden shed into a ceramics studio. It had a potter's wheel, a kiln, countless glazes, and so on. Everything one would need to manufacture high-quality china products. I had visited her studio once. She showed me everything: how to shape the clay to make a teacup, how the kiln worked, and how she made the dolls. The one thing she never showed me was what was under the large trapdoor she kept relegated in the far corner of the room. I had always assumed that's where she kept her clay, nice and moist and cool, until she could work with it. When grandmother was in her studio, my favorite game to play was Tea Party. Like any other little girl, I would set up a table and chairs and serve my stuffed animals tea. I always used the beautiful china teacups my grandmother made for her own use. My favorites were the ones painted with roses. As I grew up, I visited my grandmother less and less. After all, I had my own life to attend to. I became an artist myself. I found ceramics wasn't my calling and became a painter instead. So I was a tad surprised when I found out my grandmother had willed everything: her house, her studio, and even all 105 of her china dolls, to me. When I arrived at her house for the first time in 15 years, I entered the doll room. It was just as creepy as I remembered. The uneasy feeling that I was being watched caused me to shiver, as if a gust of cold wind suddenly passed through the room. Deciding I needed a break, I exited the house to walk around her studio. Everything was just as I remembered. I caught a whiff of a terrible odor, the source of which appeared to be from under the trapdoor. I heaved open the heavy wooden door, only to behold a sight I was unprepared to see. Human bodies, all dead, all rotting. The flesh and blood pooled on the floor like some kind of grotesque, fermenting soup. I called the police, sobbing and hysterical. Soon enough, the house was wrapped up tightly in caution tape. I later learned, after the thorough police investigation, that roughly 110 people had vanished throughout the decades in close proximity to my grandmother's house. The victims were all people nobody would give much thought about, like orphans with no parents or homes. It seemed the bodies in the basement were identified as among those who disappeared recently. "What of the others?" I asked. The police informed me that forensic analysis revealed the bone in the bone china my grandmother produced was not animal bone, but human bone. My grandmother cremated her victims and used their bone ash to produce the clay for her fine bone china. The cups I drank tea from as a child were made from somebody's bones. Now, I no longer try to convince myself all my discomfort was simply paranoia. After all, it seems each doll was made of a different victim's ground-up bones. The bones in the 105 dolls originally belonged to 105 young girls, just like me. I am dying. No, scratch that. I'm already dead. I've been dead for a long time. I just didn't know it. But now my body is shutting down. My flesh is rotting away. I can no longer move around or even leave this bed. The doctors have given up on me. There is nothing anyone can do but wait. I guess I might as well tell my story. It began this past January, when I woke up one morning and felt off somehow. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something wasn't right. Stumbling to the bathroom, I looked in the mirror and was shocked at how pale I'd become. My skin had taken on a sickly gray pallor that couldn't be explained by a lack of sunlight alone. I splashed water on my face and took a hot shower, but the color still didn't return to my cheeks. As the morning wore on, I became aware of how dulled my senses were. Colors looked muted, sounds were faint and distorted, and I couldn't smell the smog from the city buses or the coffee in my local Starbucks. As usual, I took the bus to work and watched the city sweep by with dull eyes. There was a sense of fatigue deep inside my bone marrow, and I couldn't seem to shake it off. When I got to the office building where I worked as an accountant, I immediately immersed myself in work. I took calls, answered emails, and added up transactions, all while feeling lifeless and detached from reality. When a colleague made a snide remark about me being a woman in a male-dominated work environment, I didn't so much as shoot a burning glare his way. I simply didn't have the energy to care. Normally, I would have assumed I was coming down with the flu, but other than my pale skin and sluggishness, I had no symptoms of any illness, at least none that I knew of. I considered calling my doctor, but decided to wait a few days and see if I improved on my own. That Saturday, I went out to get drinks with my friends, figuring a little fun might revive me. In order to counteract the ugly pallor of my skin, I applied copious amounts of blush to my cheeks. Since I didn't usually wear that much makeup, the girls noticed and asked me about it. "Haven't you noticed what I look like?" I exclaimed. "I'm completely washed out." "No, you aren't," said Savannah, my best friend. "You look great." "Don't just say that to make me feel better." "I'm not. You don't look pale, Laura." The others agreed. I was confused. Could this all be in my head? But what about the sluggishness, the dulled senses, the constant fatigue? Was it just my mind fucking with me? Finally, I caved and made an appointment with my doctor. She ran a battery of tests, all of which came back negative. "Maybe you aren't getting enough vitamins," she suggested. "Try switching up your diet a little." I began to take supplements and make sure I was getting enough vitamin C and protein, but it didn't help. I began to lose weight. My lips became perpetually cracked, and my hair appeared to be thinning. Nobody but me noticed anything physically wrong, not even my own family. I grew used to the perpetual fatigue, but my senses were getting worse. I felt so detached that I no longer had emotions. One evening, while out for dinner with Savannah, I saw my ex-boyfriend George with another woman. I recognized her as a girl he'd met the summer before, when we took a road trip to New Orleans. I felt no anger, no jealousy, just nothing. "I think you're depressed," Savannah told me. "I don't think so," I muttered. I wasn't unhappy. I was just too numb to be sad. My physical condition worsened. 3 months after the symptoms first began, I was down 2 dress sizes and had lost so much hair I had to buy a wig. I looked like a walking corpse, and still nobody noticed. Desperate, I began to do my own research and came across something called the Cotard delusion, or walking corpse syndrome. Walking corpse syndrome delusion is a mental illness in which a person believes themselves to be dead or lacking blood in organs. It's rare, but for those suffering from the delusion, it's horrifying. I wondered if walking corpse syndrome was the explanation for my strange affliction. I certainly felt like I was dead, and since nobody else saw the physical changes I had undergone, maybe I was just insane, although the possibility didn't quite add up with my current situation. I went to a psychiatrist. He labeled me as a hypochondriac and put me on anti-anxiety pills. They didn't help. One day at work, my boss called me into his office. He was worried about me because I looked so thin. The decaying began a month or two later. Patches of my skin would turn black and disintegrate. I lost sensation in my hands and feet. The smell of rotting meat formed a fog around me. I had lost so much weight, I resembled a skeleton rather than a human. My eyes had receded inside my skull. My teeth were turning yellow, and I could barely even walk. Finally, I was checked into the hospital. Test after test revealed nothing. No medication helped. Surgery to remove the neurotic tissue failed. I overheard a doctor describe me as a living corpse. Even though I was technically alive, my body was in a state of post-mortem decay. None of it made sense. 2 months ago, I was sent home to die. I don't have much time left. I can't bring myself to care about my impending death. I haven't felt anything real in so long. I've spent a lot of time wondering how this could have happened. Before it all began, I was healthy, both mentally and physically. Although I've always been a bit of a skeptic, I'm beginning to believe there are other forces at work. When George and I went down to New Orleans over a year ago, we walked into a strange little shop run by an older lady who claimed to be a witch. When I laughed at her, she glared at me with the intensity of 1,000 suns and muttered something that sent chills down my spine. Die. He started as a surgeon. He wasn't world famous or anything, but he took pride in his work. It wasn't his plan in life to become a surgeon, but rather the path chosen for him at a young age by a brooding, overbearing family. His father was a thoracic surgeon, as was his father before him, his sister a neurological surgeon, and his brother an ophthalmic surgeon. He never really cared for the family business. Sure, the money was good, but it wasn't what he wanted to do. He simply went the route his family directed him to go in. Eventually, he graduated med school and became a vascular surgeon. He came across his first 3 subjects at a gym in a nearby town. The first was a well-built 30-year-old man who he came to find out, after inspecting the contents of his wallet, was named Adam Bond. He kept Adam in a small room that locked from the outside, most times strapped to a table with feeding tubes. That is when he wasn't sedated. He did the same with his second and third subjects, 29-year-old Richard Townsend and 27-year-old David Smith. He was always a bit different from his family. The men in his family were all strong, outgoing individuals, and the women all gorgeous and brilliant. He, however, was shy and timid, and physically much less imposing than his kin. While his siblings fared well in the social aspect of their respective schooling careers, he kept to himself, and was the subject to the crueler sides of young adulthood at the hands of his peers. His 4th and 5th victims were 22-year-old John Baberi and 25-year-old John Will. As with his previous 3 subjects, he waited for them to exit the gym in the nearby town, followed them home, and essentially stalked them, waiting for his moment to strike, where he would sedate and abduct them, bringing them to the warehouse he'd rented out and constructed his makeshift hospital rooms in. Being an introvert, he found solace in being alone. He chose in favor the normal nightlife of a wealthy surgeon, to stay by himself, going so far as not to interact with anyone outside the walls of the hospital at which he was employed. He spent his time studying, learning more about the profession he was pushed into, seemingly deciding to give it his all, even though it wasn't his primary interest in life. Once he had all 5 subjects in the warehouse, all under sedation and essentially with their lives in his hands, he began the next step of his plan. On Adam Bond, he removed both arms and both of his legs, using his training as a vascular surgeon to ensure the procedure went by without a hitch, stitching him up and placing him back under sedation. Then he moved on to Richard Townsend. From Richard, he amputated a left leg. From David, a right arm. From John B. and John W., he got a right leg and a left arm, respectively. These last 4 didn't receive the same courtesy as Adam had. They were left in their fake hospital rooms to bleed out. Due to his solidarity, he eventually spent too much time in his own head. He began having the feeling that he was wasting his life and that he had a bigger project to work on. This revelation came while going through an old photo album from his childhood. It was a picture that reminded him of the one passion he'd ever had. He'd always been fascinated by marionettes. He had been introduced to them at the local children's theater at a young age and harbored a deep-rooted longing to learn and to perfect the craft, which is something he came close to in his lonely childhood. Something snapped in him when he saw that picture, and he never showed up for work again. Amidst the screams of his other 4 expiring victims, he then proceeded to attach each severed limb to the torso of Adam Bond, ignoring the expertise he possessed to perhaps allow the limbs to work, at least in a minimal capacity. Instead, he focused all of his attention on keeping Adam alive. When his work in the mock operating rooms was finished, he wheeled Adam out to an area of the warehouse that housed a small stage with a balcony behind it. He then went on to attach hooks in Adam's new hands and feet and connected thick steel wires to the hooks. The wires led up to small wheels, then continued to the top of the balcony in a crudely fashioned pulley system. The motionless yet conscious body of Adam Bond laid there on the ground as the mad doctor climbed up the stairs to the top of the balcony. He then made his dream come true. He yanked on the handles that connected to the other end of the steel wires that were now a part of Adam. Adam rose up to his feet and moved in the ways the once respected surgeon wanted him to move. He was finally controlling the best marionette of them all. He had created his very own living, breathing puppet. This story contains very strong themes of suicide. If you are sensitive to this subject matter, please skip this story. Have you ever felt suicidal? I'm not talking you're sad, but truly wanted to die. I felt that way since 5 minutes and 43 seconds after my birth when my twin sister Anna came out of my mother. For years after my birth, I felt like I was living in a constant shadow of my twin, always wondering if I can amount up to her. Many years went by, and I found someone I thought would help me with my pain. Someone by the name of Shelby. She was a witch, and she said she can give me everlasting beauty. At the time, I had no idea what I was getting myself into, or what she meant by everlasting. Surely enough, the witch helped me get rid of the scar on the side of my face, and my snowy white hair turned black, and me and my sister were identical. After that, my sister and I became best friends. It was no longer Anna and the ugly one. It was Anna and Bella. My sister and I were almost perfect twins. We even started dressing the same, listening to the same music, and everything. This was the happiest I have ever felt in my life. I went back to the witch to thank her, but her store was nowhere to be found. Anna and I were each other's everything for about 10 years. Then we went to a party and she drove the car with both of us in it down into a ditch, and when the ambulance came, she was pronounced dead on arrival. I was left untouched. Me and my sister were no longer identical twins, even though we haven't been for years. With Anna's age came the time on her face and body. Her baby soft skin turned not as bubbly, even though she used cream and everything she could to keep up with it. I, on the other hand, hadn't aged since my 20s. I missed my sister dearly, more than I thought I would, but I could still see her ghost in the winter months. You see, I thought that was because she was killed. However, that was not the case, as I would soon find out. My sister told me to seek out the witch and see why everyone else can die, but not me. After a long journey, I found the witch again and got the answers I thought I wanted. The witch said,
"I know why you are here, and you are wondering why you can only see her in the winter. Have a seat and I'll tell you."
So I sat down, and she began telling me the story of how on Halloween night, the wall between the living and the dead is broken open, and the dead can be with their loved ones through the cold months. to ensure that they won't be cold and alone through the winter. That is why, when a ghost is near you, you get a cold chill, and also why the winter months are so cold.
I gave you everlasting beauty as you asked. You can never die just like your beauty, but however, there is a way to be with your sister once again.
I told her to please tell me. I would do anything to be with my sister again. She said, if I want to be with my sister again, I have to whisper doubts, hopelessness, broken thoughts into a suicidal person's ear, forcing them to act upon it. When one of them dies, a part of me would die as well. I thought long and hard, and the more I pondered, the more I realized that seeing my sister more than 3 months a year was more important than your lives. So when you are alone and thinking about ending it during the winter months, I'll be there, making sure your thoughts go directly towards me seeing my sister again. If you're not familiar with the term, skin hunger is the result of a lack of physical affection. It does not necessarily deal with sexual desire, though it can certainly heighten one's passion after a lengthy dry spell. It is, therefore, aptly described as a hunger. If you have no clue what I'm talking about, consider yourself lucky. For those of you who do, and I'm sure there are at least a few of you out there, I can empathize. I've had quite a dry spell myself, to the point that I've been retreating to the farthest corners of my humanity, trying desperately to erase the hunger from existing. I will likely tear myself apart in an attempt to remove a piece of me that makes me human. I will eagerly destroy my normalcy for the sake of feeling less human, because maybe, just maybe once it's gone, I won't feel the need to belong anymore. And then I can exist in a more tolerable state of brokenness. Perhaps you think I'm some sort of thirsty, melodramatic, weeaboo virgin neckbeard who only has an assortment of waifu body pillows and figurines to cope with my clearly well-deserved loneliness. You're remarkably wrong. I keep my beard tidy. But you're entitled to your opinions. To you, I would simply ask if you've ever experienced skin hunger, or if you could even possibly imagine how it might feel. I'm not looking to cause any arguments, but simply try and explain. I'm here to help, you know. After all, isn't that what we're here for? To connect on the same level, share a side of our humanity, and come together in fear of the darkness that flows forth freely? I'm sure you've learned quite a lot reading about things related to apocalyptic scenarios, dealing with werewolves and vampires, and handling other sorts of horrible abominations. So then, how to deal with skin hunger? Well, pets can certainly help alleviate the issue, though it's not enough to cure the problem completely. For that, you really do need another human. I can't safely recommend kidnapping and keeping someone in your basement, of course. You'd need a great deal of time and effort to get to that point, where they'd be willing to provide you any comfort. Time you may not have if you're already starving. I would also advise against keeping a corpse or even a limb or two. You won't get the same effect when they're cold, and keeping them warm can be one hell of an obstacle. Not to mention the parts naturally degrade, so you'd need to get out and get a replacement every so often, and we don't want you getting caught. Skinning, on the other hand, you can find plenty of tutorials on tanning hides online. Not to mention keeping leather warm is easy enough. But hey, if you need a hands-on demonstration, just let me know. I'd love to meet you.